a young foreigner, despised and poor, ended up bathing all of Europe in blood and changing the fate of millions with his boundless ambition. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. The boy who arrived in France from Corsica in 1779 did not fit in anywhere. Napoleon Bonaparte, as he was then called, spoke French with a thick Italian accent that his military schoolmates constantly ridiculed. He was short, poor, proud, and foreign in a world where those four traits condemned you to contempt. The French aristocrats who dominated the military academies saw him as an intruder from a backward island that was not even completely French. Corsica had been under French control for barely 10 years when he was born. He spent nights alone, reading about Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and other ancient conquerors while his classmates mocked his surname and origin. That resentment, that constant feeling of being considered inferior, forged something dangerous inside him. An ambition without limits. An obsessive need to prove everyone wrong. The French Revolution of 1789 changed everything. The old aristocratic order, the world that had belittled him, began to crumble. The streets of Paris ran red with blood. King Louis XVI ended up on the guillotine. All of Europe trembled before the revolutionary fury emanating from France. The monarchies of the continent understood the message. If the revolution was not crushed, it would spread like a plague. And they declared war. For the young Corsican officer, it was the perfect opportunity. While France desperately needed capable generals, noble birth ceased to be a requirement. Talent became the only currency that mattered. Napoleon, now Frenchified, demonstrated that talent in terrifying amounts. His first moment of glory came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon. The port city had rebelled against the revolution and was protected by British and Spanish fleets. The revolutionary generals had made no progress for weeks. Napoleon, then a mere 24-year-old artillery captain, proposed a bold plan to take the fortifications dominating the harbor and force the evacuation of enemy fleets through concentrated artillery fire. They gave him command, and it worked. Cannonballs rained down on the port. The British ships fled. Toulon fell. Napoleon was immediately promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old and had just proven something he would repeat again and again. He saw the battlefield differently than anyone else. Where others saw unsolvable problems, he identified weak points and opportunities. But the real leap came in 1796, when he was assigned command of the Army of Italy. It was the worst possible fate. The soldiers were hungry, barefoot, unpaid, poorly equipped, and demoralized. The Italian campaign was considered secondary, an unimportant front where Paris sent leftovers. The Austrians and their Piedmontese allies dominated northern Italy with well-fed and superior armies. Napoleon gathered his officers and promised them something simple: victory, glory, and loot. He told them that the wealthy cities of northern Italy would be theirs if they followed him. He did not appeal to abstract revolutionary ideals. He spoke the language hungry soldiers understood, and then he proved his genius. He divided his enemies. While the Austrians and Piedmontese expected a frontal attack, Napoleon moved his army at speeds no one believed possible. They marched by night, attacked at dawn, struck where the enemy was weak, and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. In weeks, he defeated the Piedmontese army and removed it from the war. The Austrians were left alone, confused, unable to predict his moves. Battle after battle fell to his strategy. Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago, Mondovi, Lodi. Names that would soon resonate throughout Europe. At Lodi, he crossed a bridge under intense Austrian artillery fire, personally leading the charge as bullets whistled around him. His soldiers, who days before had been hungry and desperate, now adored him. They affectionately and admiringly called him the Little Corporal. Italy fell like dominoes. Milan, Mantua, Venice. The Austrians signed peace in 1797, ceding huge territories. Napoleon returned to Paris as a conquering hero, laden with looted Italian treasures he sent to the revolutionary government. He was 28 years old. The French government, the Directory, viewed him with a mixture of admiration and fear. He was too popular, too ambitious. So when Napoleon proposed invading Egypt to cut British trade routes to India, they gladly accepted. Better to have him far away, conquering exotic lands, than near, conspiring. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 was a military disaster disguised as a romantic adventure. Napoleon conquered Cairo, and the pyramids provided a dramatic stage for propaganda, but Admiral Nelson's British fleet destroyed his ships at the Battle of the Nile, leaving him trapped in Egypt. Thousands of soldiers died from disease, thirst, and combat against Ottomans and Mamelukes. When he tried to expand toward Syria, the siege of Acre failed miserably. But Napoleon was a master of propaganda. His bulletins sent to France narrated glorious victories, scientific discoveries, and Eastern conquests while carefully omitting defeats, plagues, and abandoned soldiers. France hailed him as a new Alexander the Great. When news arrived that France faced new invasions and the Directory staggered in political chaos, Napoleon made a decision. He abandoned his army in Egypt and secretly returned to Paris. He left thousands of men trapped in the desert while he sailed back to seize the political crisis. On the 18th of Brumaire in the year 8 of the revolutionary calendar, corresponding to November 1799 in the traditional calendar, Napoleon staged a coup d'état. Surrounded by loyal soldiers, he dissolved the Directory and established the consulate, appointing himself first consul with near-dictatorial powers. He was 30 years old and had just become the ruler of France without firing a single shot in Paris. The Republic still technically existed, but now it had a master. The wars continued. Austria, Russia, Great Britain, all formed coalitions one after another trying to defeat France. And one after another, Napoleon crushed them. At Marengo in 1800, his army was on the verge of defeat when a desperate last-minute counterattack turned the battle into a victory. Luck was on his side, but no one remembered the luck. Only the victory. Hohenlinden, Ulm, Austerlitz. Each battle added more glory to his legend. Austerlitz, fought on December 2, 1805, was his masterpiece. Facing Russian and Austrian armies superior in number, Napoleon feigned weakness, lured his enemies into a trap, and destroyed them in a battle that lasted a single day. The emperors of Austria and Russia fled defeated. It was called the Battle of the Three Emperors, and Napoleon was the only victor. But the victories had a cost rarely mentioned in the triumphant bulletins. Tens of thousands of young Frenchmen died in each campaign. Military hospitals were slaughterhouses where the wounded agonized without proper care. Conquered towns and cities were systematically looted to feed the army. Forced requisitions left entire populations on the brink of starvation. Spain, Italy, Germany, Poland, all occupied territories bled resources to sustain French imperial ambitions. Napoleon saw armies as disposable tools. When informed of massive casualties, his typical response was calculating. One night in Paris will replace those losses. Men were numbers, renewable resources France could produce indefinitely, as long as he kept winning. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in a ceremony designed to rival the ancient Roman Caesars. The Pope traveled to Paris to officiate, but at the climactic moment, Napoleon took the crown from the pontiff's hands and placed it on his own head. The message was clear. His power did not come from God or tradition. It came from his own will and military genius. He redrew the map of Europe as if it were his personal chessboard. He created the Kingdom of Italy and named himself king. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had lasted 1,000 years. He placed his brothers on newly invented thrones. Joseph as king of Spain, Louis as king of Holland, Jerome as king of Westphalia. His family, the same poor Corsican family despised by the aristocracy, now ruled half of Europe. The Napoleonic Code reorganized French laws and was exported to conquered territories. It abolished feudal privileges, established equality before the law, secularized the government. For many historians, these reforms modernized Europe and laid the foundations of contemporary nation-states. Napoleon saw himself as an enlightened reformer, bringing rationality and progress to a continent trapped in medieval traditions. But those reforms came at the points of French bayonets. They came accompanied by military occupation, cultural imposition, and systematic looting. The liberated peoples soon discovered they had changed old aristocratic masters for new French masters who demanded taxes, soldiers, and absolute obedience. Great Britain remained the unbreakable enemy. Protected by its navy and the English Channel, it withstood all invasion attempts. Napoleon could not cross the water, so he tried to economically strangle the British through the continental blockade, forbidding all of Europe to trade with them. It was a disaster. European economies depended on British trade. Smuggling became rampant. Napoleon's allied nations suffered while Great Britain found new markets. When Russia began breaking the blockade by secretly trading with the British, Napoleon made the decision that would define his downfall. He would invade Russia. In June 1812, the Grande Army crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. 600,000 men, the largest army ever assembled up to that moment, marched east. French, Italians, Poles, Germans, all under the imperial eagles. Napoleon expected a quick campaign, a decisive battle, Russian capitulation, victorious return before winter. Nothing went according to plan. The Russians refused to fight. They constantly retreated, burning crops and towns as they withdrew, leaving scorched earth behind. The Grande Army advanced through an empty desert where it found no food or forage for horses. The Russian distances were immense, incomprehensible to European minds used to compact territories. Weeks of marching without finding the main enemy. Diseases began immediately. Dysentery, typhus, fevers. Thousands died before seeing combat. Horses collapsed from lack of food. Supply lines stretched until they broke. By the time they reached Smolensk in August, the army had already lost 150,000 men without a major battle. The only great battle came at Borodino in September. 70,000 casualties in a single day, one of the bloodiest fights of the Napoleonic Wars. Technically, it was a French victory because the Russians retreated, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Napoleon lost tens of thousands of irreplaceable veterans. The Russians simply fell back further inland. Moscow was empty when they arrived. The population had evacuated. Then the fires began, probably started by the Russians themselves. The city burned for days. The French army occupied a carbonized shell while waiting for Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace. Peace never came. October passed. November arrived with early snow. Napoleon finally accepted the unacceptable. They had to retreat. 600,000 men had entered Russia. The retreat began with fewer than 100,000 fit to fight. What followed was a frozen apocalypse. The Grande Army disintegrated during the retreat. The Russian winter fell with unusual fury. Temperatures of 30 degrees below zero froze men as they marched. Starving soldiers killed each other for pieces of bread. Horses were devoured as soon as they fell. Russian Cossacks constantly attacked the retreating column, hunting the stragglers. The crossing of the Berezina River in November was catastrophic. Engineers built improvised bridges under enemy fire while thousands tried to cross simultaneously. The bridges collapsed, thousands drowned in icy waters or were trampled in desperate stampedes. Of 600,000 men, fewer than 30,000 returned fit to fight. The rest died of cold, hunger, disease, or combat. It was the greatest military catastrophe of the modern era up to that point. Napoleon abandoned his army in December and secretly returned to Paris. For the second time in his career, he left his dying soldiers behind while he fled to protect his political position. Propaganda tried to minimize the disaster, but the myth of invincibility was broken. Europe smelled blood. Prussia, Austria, Sweden, all the states Napoleon had humiliated formed a new coalition. For the first time, they fought united and coordinated. Napoleon showed he was still a military genius, winning several battles in 1813 with improvised armies of young recruits. But he could no longer replace losses as quickly as before. France was exhausted. 20 years of continuous war had drained the male population. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, called the Battle of the Nations, involved over 500,000 soldiers. Napoleon faced Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes simultaneously. For 3 days he fought against impossible odds. Finally, he had to retreat. The empire began to collapse. The Allies invaded France in 1814. Paris fell in March. Napoleon's marshals, his brothers-in-arms who had followed him across Europe, finally rebelled and demanded he abdicate. They were tired. Their men were dying defending an empire that no longer existed. Napoleon abdicated on April 6, 1814. He was exiled to Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean. The man who had ruled from Spain to Poland now administered a rock with 12,000 inhabitants. Europe sighed in relief and began to reorganize itself at the Congress of Vienna, attempting to restore the old monarchical order Napoleon had destroyed. But the exiled emperor was not finished. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with 1,000 men and landed in France. King Louis XVIII, restored by the Allies, sent troops to arrest him. When soldiers met Napoleon on the road, he walked alone toward them, opened his coat, and shouted, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if any of you want to kill your emperor, here I am." The soldiers cheered and joined him. Regiment after regiment switched sides. The king fled. Without a single shot fired, Napoleon retook France in 20 days. The 100 Days had begun. Europe responded immediately. All powers declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized massive armies. There would be no negotiation this time, only total destruction. Napoleon assembled an army and marched to Belgium to destroy the British and Prussian forces before they could unite. It almost worked. He defeated the Prussians at Ligny on June 16th. Then he turned toward the British forces commanded by Wellington. Waterloo, June 18, 1815. The battle lasted all day. Napoleon launched attack after attack against British positions on the ridges. Wellington resisted desperately. The battle hung in the balance. Then, in the afternoon, the Prussians appeared. The army Napoleon believed defeated had regrouped and marched all night to join the battle. The French collapsed. The Imperial Guard, elite troops that had never known defeat, broke ranks and fled. Napoleon tried to die in battle, but his officers dragged him from the field. It was all over. This time there was no soft exile. The British sent him to St. Helena, a volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from anywhere. There he spent the last 6 years of his life dictating self-justifying memoirs and complaining about the climate. He died on May 5, 1821, probably of stomach cancer, although theories of poisoning never completely disappeared. He was 51 years old. The legacy he left is complicated and contradictory. France venerates him as a national hero. His tomb in Les Invalides is a magnificent monument visited by millions. He is credited with modernizing laws, destroying feudalism, inspiring European nationalisms. But the numbers are terrifying. The Napoleonic Wars killed between 3 and 6 million people, depending on estimates. Entire generations of French men disappeared on battlefields from Spain to Russia. Civilian populations suffered famines, looting, epidemics caused by marching armies. Napoleon saw this as the necessary price of greatness. On St. Helena, he wrote that he had tried to unite Europe under rational and enlightened principles, that history would vindicate him. He never showed remorse for the dead. He saw them as inevitable sacrifices on the altar of progress. His tactics revolutionized warfare. The system of independent corps operating separately and concentrating quickly. The massive use of artillery. The speed of movement that confused enemies. Decisive battles seeking total destruction of the enemy rather than limited maneuvers. All these innovations dominated military thought for more than a century. But he also industrialized slaughter. He transformed wars from small professional armies into total conflicts involving entire nations. The concept of levy in mass citizen recruitment, allowed armies of hundreds of thousands, but also normalized sacrificing entire populations. Was he a genius or a butcher? The answer is probably both. He was an undeniable tactical genius whose campaigns are still studied in military academies. He was a legal reformer who modernized governmental structures. He was a visionary who imagined Europe united under common principles. And he was a butcher who sacrificed millions in wars of aggression fueled mainly by personal ambition. He was a tyrant who restored autocracy after revolution. He was a conqueror who submerged a continent in 20 years of death. His life shows that these categories are not mutually exclusive. Exceptional individuals are rarely simply good or bad. They are complex, contradictory, simultaneously admirable and monstrous. Napoleon was the humiliated boy who never forgave the world for despising him. He was the brilliant strategist who saw patterns where others saw chaos. He was the reformer who modernized institutions. He was the egomaniac who measured his worth by conquered territories and destroyed enemies. Europe never forgot the lessons of his era. The balance of power designed after his fall tried to prevent any nation from dominating again. That system maintained relative peace for nearly a century until it collapsed in 1914 with another catastrophic war. Because in the end, Napoleon proved something terrifying, that a single individual sufficiently brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless can change the fate of entire continents. That genius and destruction can inhabit the same person. That glory and horror are frequently inseparable. His shadow still stretches over modern history. His name evokes simultaneous admiration and repulsion. Debates about his legacy continue without clear resolution. And perhaps that is fitting, because Napoleon Bonaparte was many things, but he was never simple.